Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we'll be cooking a food that is meant to heal the sick. It's not soup, it's not hot cereal, it's not custard, it's somewhere in between. It's called Panada. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I don't know about you, but I've never heard about Panada in a modern sense. You'll find it in a modern cookbook. It's interesting, it shows up in the 18th century cookbooks, but if you go back, it'll show up in 16th century literature, especially 17th century. It's English, sometimes you'll find French references, and as I've been digging, found references to it in Italy. Now, it's an interesting recipe in that it does stay pretty much the same. There are two kinds of versions, a sweet version, a savory version, and it changes a little. You'll even find it in 19th century cookbooks, but it definitely starts to change into something a bit different than what the 18th century version is. Kind of more desserty and not necessarily made with bread. Panada is classically made with bread. And it is, again, something for people that are invalids, sick people, children, but not necessarily always that way. We find something very, very similar served in taverns for breakfast in North America in the 18th century. I mean, that's the only thing they're serving, a great big bowl of panada, and they're eating it up. That I find a bit strange because it's not the kind of thing you would think of as tavern food. Got a couple recipes here. This one is from John Knott. This is early, this is 1723 or so. It says, to make a panado, there are multiple fun spellings of this. To make a panado, let's see, set a quart of spring waterina skillet. Oh no, it's all run together. Sorry about that. It says, set on a quart of spring water in a skillet. Let it boil sometime over the fire. Cut a penny white loaf into slices as thin as a wafer. Lay them on a dish set over a chafing dish of coals. Put your water into it with some large mace, a quarter of a pound of currants picked clean and washed. Let it stew till it is thick enough. Those are always great instructions. Then, having dissolved some fine sugar in rose water, sweeten it to your palate. That's a sweet version. That definitely is something that you would probably serve as dessert. So we have white bread. So he specifically talks about white bread, cut very, very thin. He's gently cooking it over these a chafing dish with coals, so it's not a fast boil. It's got mace in it, which is very, very common for panada. I don't know why mace and not nutmeg, but mace and currants, and then we actually sweeten it. And sometimes in different recipes, you will also add some wine. I think in his other one, there's another recipe here in the same cookbook, mace, cinnamon, currants, and then it gets canary or white wine. Beat some yolks of eggs in and put it with sugar. So it's definitely turning into something like a custard. So there's definitely multiple versions even here in the early 18th century. Now, the classic cookbook from the 18th century is Hannah Glass's cookbook, which is probably the most popular all throughout the time period. Hannah Glass has a recipe for panada, and it's probably the simplest one. And if you're going to find reprints in other cookbooks, which people are always stealing from one cookbook to another, it's going to be this recipe. You must take a quart of water in a nice clean saucepan, a blade of mace, a large piece of crumb of bread. Let it boil 2 minutes, not very long at all. Then take out the bread, bruise it in a basin very fine, mix as much water as will make it as thick as you would have. The rest you pour away. Sweeten it to your palate. Put in a piece of butter as big as a walnut. Don't put in any wine, she says. It spoils it. And then you may grate in a little nutmeg. This is a hearty and good diet for sick people. So this recipe definitely is a very, very simple version and specifically meant for sick people because it's very, very easy to digest. It's not like meat or even dry bread, which can kind of sit in your stomach in a strange way, but the most simplest thing for someone to digest. Now, it's strange that we have this version, which is oriented towards sick people, and then the one from 1723, which was definitely more desserty with currants and all kinds of strange things in it. So we're going to be doing a recipe that's somewhere in between these two, and we'll just see what it turns out like. So today's recipe is out of The Experienced English Housekeeper. This is 1769. And it's actually got a couple of different recipes, one for sweet, one for savory. We're gonna do the savory one here. To make a panada, grate the crumb of a penny loaf, boil it in a pint of water with 1 onion and a few peppercorns till quite thick and soft. Then put in 2 ounces of butter, a little salt, half a pint of thick cream. It's gonna be good. Keep it stirring till it is like a fine custard. Pour it into a soup plate, serve it up, and then there's a little added piece. You may use sugar or currants instead of onions and peppercorns, if you please. We're gonna be doing this with the onions and peppercorns. So we have our penny loaf, and I've already sliced this up. We don't want it to just toss it in whole. One of those recipes said to slice it thin, so I sliced it nice and thin. We have our onion. We're not gonna chop this up. We're gonna leave this mostly whole in there because I think we wanna take it back out. We just want the onion flavor. We've got some butter, we've got peppercorns, a little salt, and our cream. We're ready to go. We're gonna put the water on the fire and get it boiling. So frankly, when I first read this recipe, I did not think it sounded good at all, but this actually looks good. Smells really good too. When it was on the fire, we broke it up with the spoon a little bit so that those bread pieces broke up, cooked it for about a half an hour, and it really kind of thickened up and lost its texture, so it kind of broke down, which is what I wanted to happen. Off the fire it comes, and we took out the onion and added in the butter, let that melt, then put in the cream and a little bit of nutmeg. And well, tell you what, it really looks good. So let's find out what this really tastes like. Here we go. We'll mix in a little bit of that nutmeg. And those peppercorns are still hiding out in there, so be careful. Wow. Whoa. This is really good. I mean, it's really good. This is the savory version, not the sweet version, which is, I smell the nutmeg and it makes me think of sweet things. It's wonderfully savory, just the right amount of salt that got added in there, butter, cream. Well, it's just really, really good. I can see why this would be something in the dessert book. And that John Knott book is full of kind of high-end recipes, so it is really good. I can see how this could definitely be something for an ill person, someone who was sick, and they needed something that they could eat that wouldn't upset their stomach, because this is so smooth, so innocuous, especially if you knocked back the spices, you didn't make it too sweet or too salty. This could be a very, very bland food if you wanted to make it for someone who was ill, and it'd be perfect for that, and there's just nothing to upset you. So we mentioned that this was food for the sick, and that's, sometimes this would be served in taverns or even as a dessert, but it was also food for the poor. Very interesting story. In the late 18th century, there was a journal about someone from England traveling in northern Italy, and they saw a group of boys eating out of one big bowl. They were eating panada, and they were talking to the boys about where this came from, and they said that their mother had died, their father was begging on the streets, and they would climb the trees and pick grapevine leaves for a restaurateur. They were right outside of a restaurant, and he would use these grapevine leaves to put stoppers in bottles or decanters to keep flies out and whatnot. And he paid the boys in panada. So that's the only thing they could afford to eat. Very interesting story right there from the 18th century. One of the things I love about digging into these recipes is you never know where you're going to go. Sometimes the recipe works out exactly like you expect it. Other times you get really surprised. And so you really have to try them out if you want to know what it's going to turn into. This one is exactly that, a very surprising recipe, and very good when I did not expect it to be good at all. So amazed by this one. If you want another episode, similar dish and just so good, check out this cheese soup recipe.